In our previous update, we gave you a synopsis of the book Undaunted Courage by Stephen Ambrose. And as promised, in this follow-up, I was going to share with you surprises. We're actually going to do two follow-ups. Part 2 here. I'm going to share with you 4 key surprises I took away from reading that book. And our third and final update, I'll give you a few more wonders that I was left with from reading that book. And it's ultimately on the topic of Lewis and Clark. So the 4 surprises that we're going to cover in this update: perception, then versus now, as well as not being the first, preferred foods, and finally for this update will be the aftermath, specifically with respect to Meriwether Lewis.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, Sawadee Krupp. I'm Stephen, and this is my video log, The Psy American.
Perception, right? Perception then versus now. Now you would assume, like, okay, these explorers are coming from the East Coast, they're going over the Great Plains, they're going over the Rocky Mountains to the Pacific Northwest, and you would think in their minds that, wow, it must have been heaven for them to see, for the first time, the Rocky Mountains and conquer them and then get to the Pacific Northwest, this majestic land, right? And they had coming over the Great Plains. So in my perception, modern day, you would think like, okay, everything leading up to the Rocky Mountains would have been boring, right? Just this boring Great Plains country. And this is coming from someone who's lived on the Great Plains. Before the Rocky Mountains, it's just this endless expanse of plains, plain, boring plains. So my perception, now would be like, okay, they must have been in heaven reaching those Rocky Mountains in the Northwest. And that would have been from their perspective, this heavenly oasis. But it turns out, one of the surprises I got from reading this, that for them, for most of, at least according to the accounts by the explorers, that for them, in their minds and their perception, the heavenly oasis was actually the Great Plains, and they actually dreaded the Rocky Mountain region and the Pacific Northwest, according to their journals and their accounts. So basically, the reason being, like, you think, what? Everyone loves the beautiful Rocky Mountains and the Pacific Northwest and the ocean. How could they, when they made it to the Rocky Mountains and they were in modern-day Oregon, Washington, they were dreaming about, just can't wait to get back to the plains. And the reason, turns out, is because obviously food source. And at those times, the Great Plains were just full of bison. So the North American buffalo, right? Not only the American explorers, but the natives too. I guess it would have been spring, summer, all the natives in the Rocky Mountains would migrate to the Great Plains to do the great hunt. There was not only the bison, of course, there was a lot of elk, deer, and other game. But they were mostly grazing on the Great Plains, right? And so that was the source of food and relative commerce. And the reason why they dread the Rocky Mountains, it's kind of common sense when you think about it, and in the Pacific Northwest, was basically the weather, right? Crossing the Rocky Mountains required obviously great weather, so they couldn't do it too late in the season. A winter camp had to be set up before on the east side, and then of course they had to make it in clear before the first snows really came. And some of these parts of the Rocky Mountains, of course, had eternal snow year round in the peaks and stuff. So a lot of places were impassable and trying to find the best place to cross. And so there was a lot of near-death experiences that the explorers faced in the Rocky Mountains, and they probably would never have made it if they didn't have help from not only, as I mentioned, their native teenage slave. Essentially, she was the wife of one of the French interpreters, and so they had a weird system of interpreting when they met a lot of the natives, because all the natives had different languages, right? And so mostly it was sign language. Some of the tribes could speak some of the different, they had some vocabulary which they could exchange, but their translation was like this chain system where it would go from one tribe's language to another, and to French, and into broken French, and then broken English, and then English. So you can imagine a lot of the stuff was lost in translation along the way. But anyway, they had some help from some natives getting across both ways to the Pacific and back. Hey, buddy. So they had some help getting across the Rocky Mountains, but of course there was several times where they were without food because there was no game and animals to eat, and they had to revert a lot, which I'll get to one of my next surprise points, to eating stuff you wouldn't normally think is civil to eat, and enjoy it at that, right? Why they didn't like the Pacific Northwest? Basically because of the miserable weather. Well, they arrived in winter, right? So very rainy and foggy. So it definitely wasn't pleasant, and they didn't enjoy it as much as you might think they would have. So they missed the sunny plains and the abundant food in the plains. So yeah, the second surprise or thing that I learned along the way from reading this book, the assumption was going into it, oh, these are the first white men to explore these parts of North America, right? So it would have been like the first exposure, prime directive of meeting natives for the first time seeing it. But actually, a lot of these natives that they met in the Great Plains as well as in the Rocky Mountains in the Pacific Northwest, it wasn't the first time they had seen white men, like I mentioned before. So it was pretty clear that the Spanish had been there before, or at least in the extended trade network, and the British were well established as fur traders in the region, and French as well. Remember, this was the Louisiana French territory, so they had a lot of stakes in there already. Particularly, I guess the earliest from Old World would have been the Spanish and their influence, and one of the immediate things that the Corps of Discovery discovered is the skill that a lot of these natives had with horses. And this is particularly in the Rocky Mountain region. So the Nez Perce, for example, that they met, they were very, very skilled herdsmen in terms of horses and being able to tame horses and ride horses with and without saddles. And they were very good hunting on horses. And obviously horses, at least according to the theory that we're all taught, were brought over from the Spanish, right? And so a lot of these natives in the Rocky Mountain and Pacific Northwest were very skilled with horses, so that was the influence of the Old World. Another thing that I had learned, or surprise, was regarding, so I mentioned earlier about food, right? So preferred food. Okay, let's just talk about game meat, all right? Game, as far as like animals that they had to hunt, right? This is back in the days, they had these musket, rifles, so they had to load, reload. Okay, so they of course they came across some of the most, the largest mammals on North America and perhaps the world at the time, including the grizzly bear, wolves, deer, elk, a lot of, rabbits, and beaver was a big one. So they ate everything they could. They had some good hunters, and they ate a lot of meat, more than, we would eat today typically. And that's hard to believe. Obviously, these guys are moving, anywhere from, depending on the terrain, 5 to 40 miles a day with all of their gear, upstream often, uphill, covering a lot of ground. So they were using a lot of calories. They ate a lot. They had really big appetites. But anyway, of all the game meat that they hunted and mammals, if you had to guess what was their preferred one, or at least which food was expressed as a preferred type of food, oftentimes when they were hungry and they were desiring a certain type of food, or they got a certain type of food when they were able to get it. As I mentioned, they ate everything from deer, elk, beaver, of course, rabbits, squirrels, groundhogs, horses. Obviously, some of their horses that they used to cross the mountains and travel, when the going got tough, they resolved to eating their horses, and not just be like this desperate last-minute attempt. It was actually like a thing that they had a plan for, especially on their return trip over the Rocky Mountains, coming from west to east, and as well as dogs. And there was actually one regular dog they didn't eat. It was Captain Clark's, or was it Lewis's dog? Well, anyway, the dog's name was Seaman, like Seaman, like Seaman, Seaman, right? So they had this dog. They didn't eat it, but they ate a lot of other dogs that they acquired from the Native Americans as well. When the going got tough, and of course they ate a lot of fish when they got to the Pacific Northwest, salmon, all the food, especially when they were hungry during the winter, when they were camped out, all the food that they preferred. What would you guess would be their preference? Okay, I'll give you a choice: deer, elk, bear, grizzly bear, beaver, dog, horse. Out of these choices of meat, which one do you think that these American explorers enjoyed the most? If they had a choice, a given choice, at least according to what the sentiments were, particularly when they were hungry. Most of you probably wouldn't guess, and this is surprising me, that in fact, what the Corps of Discovery enjoyed the most, at least according to the accounts that I'm reading here from this narrative, was actually dog. Yeah, that caught me off guard, right? So it was actually a preference meat. Maybe it wasn't a preference when they were abundant in buffalo meat. Maybe it was just a preference when they were crossing back and they had minimal meat. So dog and horse were the two types of meat that they ate a lot of crossing the Rocky Mountains. You know, they didn't buy the horses to eat directly, but they knew there would be many 3 or 4 days when there would be no more food in these crossing the Rocky Mountains, and there wasn't enough grass for the horse to keep them alive. So they had to kill a lot of their horses to eat in order to survive and make the crossing over the Rocky Mountains. But yeah, prior to that, it was dog. And they definitely wanted a lot dog, but of course they ate everything. So what happened afterwards, right? And so reading it, it doesn't just end when they get back to St. Louis. If you go through the history and read this book, of course, you'll find out that of course they were made famous, initially returning back successfully. And you know, a lot of people had written them off as doomed because back in the day, the correspondence took so long to find out and get word from, halfway across the continent. And so it was a very surprise when they got back, and they were, of course, thrust into fame upon returning. The aftermath of what happened with Captain Lewis and Captain Clark. And so it gets into that aftermath of everything. And it's actually quite tragic, at least as far as Captain Lewis is concerned. It just kind of unexpected, specifically with Lewis. But it's not tragic right away, you know. There's the initial fame and all the balls you can imagine. Balls is in terms of like parties that were thrown in their honor. And of course they were awarded with land warrants, meaning they could, basically grab any land and acquire the deeds for it based on these warrants and based on whatever the fixed price of land was at the time. And they were promoted, the two captains anyway, a lieutenant, captain and lieutenant. So Lewis was promoted to be, he was made governor of Louisiana Territory, specifically Upper Louisiana. So at that time there was a split. There was the Lower Louisiana Territory, which was basically modern day Louisiana, which they called Orleans. And then there was the rest of it was all Upper Louisiana. And so centered in St. Louis. And Clark was also made director of Indian Affairs. I think I'll post it on the screen exactly his title. But basically continued to work with Lewis in that territory. But, immediately upon returning to the United States proper at that time, Lewis obviously had to go back to Washington and report to Thomas Jefferson. And there was these grand plans because he was the main journalist. Him and Clark, everyone kept a journal during the expedition, but the two main journals obviously would have been the captains. Lewis was the one collecting all the scientific and natural sciences, observations, discovering all these like new plants never before known to the Americans or to the white man in general, new animals and fauna and flora. And so he had all of these notes and these observations, and Clark did a lot of the maps. So there was a lot of valuable information that was just, in those days, it wasn't just like you turned on the internet and you got everything you want, you published instantly. There was a lot of work put into publishing anything. It required making real plates, and manuscript was very tedious job to get anything printed back in those days, but it was very high in demand, and basically everyone was looking forward to these particular journals. And there was a few other journals that were published with speed right after the expedition, not of Lewis and Clark, but of one of the explorers. I can't remember exactly the name of. It's in the book, or I'll put it on the screen. Speaking of Captain Lewis, or Governor Lewis, he was promoted to at that time. Still a mystery to this day is he never got to publish the journal on his behalf, on his own. He got a lot of the groundwork started, went to Philadelphia, got a lot of like the best scientists to help him interpret his observations and make it book ready. But one of the things he never did at the time was actually hire an editor and get the manuscript to the press. And this was something that even Thomas Jefferson really wanted and kept on Lewis, throughout the final years after the expedition, but it never got done. And it was about to. Fast forward to 1809. A lot of unfortunate spiral events that took place after that expedition for Lewis, in particularly as governor. And there's a lot of politics you can imagine, especially with all these different forces of manifest destiny going on. From the settlers versus the trade conflicts and wars. So it ends kind of tragic, and you can read the details. I'm not really spoiling anything. I'm sure if you really wanted to know, Lewis reportedly, 1809, I believe it was, committed suicide on his way back to Washington, D.C., leaving Louisiana Territory. There was some scandals going on, a lot of debt problems he had. But yeah, he had his journals with him that never got published. But ultimately, the job did get done. Obviously, the journals made it back to Thomas Jefferson, and there was a lot of help recruited to getting an initial publication, not verbatim publication of the journals, but ultimately, like 90 years later, those would be published in full for the general public. But yeah, that was one of the mysteries. The journals would why he postponed that most important thing. Especially he had all these debt issues. He accumulated all this debt, and there was politics involved with the changing over of presidency from Thomas Jefferson to President Madison after that, the fourth president. And so a lot of politics going on at that time. I'll just say that. But still, the question is that I guess a lot of scholars too really can't answer is why didn't he make that priority to get those journals published? Because that would have made him even more famous and more popular. And there's a lot of people already subscribed to those journals, and they were promised to be published as early as 1807, 1808 when they returned. Who knows? But that was one of the mysteries, and you left hanging. A lot of scholars are still debating the answer to that question. In addition to why he committed his suicide, and why in those dire moments was he suffering from syphilis, or was it just the debt? Was he a manic depressant? And sometimes when people reach that heightened glory of being so famous and then they come back to earth, it's hard to adapt. I don't know. There's all kinds of theories that you can hypothesize. But obviously, that's not really what he's remembered for. You mentioned Lewis Clark, you think of what he did do, how he lived in the height of his life, not the fall of his life. So that wraps it up for this part 2 of 3 series on Lewis and Clark here. Stay tuned for our next update, which will be related to specific wonders and mysteries that I was left hanging with after reading this book about the general history of Lewis and Clark, including on the aftermath of not only Captain Clark, William Clark, but as well as the native woman, Sacagawea, as well as the African-American York, as well as a wonder about hybridization. So definitely look out for that update. Thanks for listening and watching and tuning in this time. Signing off, this is the Psy American.